As you know, we've been going through the book of Proverbs, a topic at a time. And recently I covered the topic of work. And then I followed that up with the topic of diligence, which amounts to hard work. On the other end of that continuum is laziness. Now, the book of Proverbs has a number of things to say about that subject. Only I'm going to probably have a hard time finding an audience for that. I think if I gave you this line and put on one end of it hard work or work, and on the other end of the line, put laziness, probably most people would say, well, I may not be the hardest worker, but neither am I lazy. They would want to be somewhere in between, and they would think that discussing laziness does not apply to them. And that may be true, and at the same time, we're dealing with the book of Proverbs, which is the book of wisdom. And in that regard, there's a number of things we can learn, even if it isn't directly talking to us. So what can we learn from the book of Proverbs concerning laziness that will apply to us? Well, that's what we want to do today. Let me begin by saying there are a number of different Hebrew words that are used for laziness in the book of Proverbs, and each of them have little nuances. One of them, for example, means slackness, and even has the connotation of deception, which I thought was interesting. Another is translated sluggard, and still another means to sink down, to let down, to be disheartened. So I'm going to go through the Proverbs that use these various words, and we're going to see what the book of Proverbs has to say about them, and I'm just going to use the one word laziness to describe them all. What I want to do is, first of all, just describe the characteristics of a lazy person from Solomon's point of view. Then the second thing I want to do is talk about the consequences of laziness. And finally, is there a cure for being lazy? So let's begin by just looking at the characteristics of laziness. Turn with me, if you will, to Proverbs 6:10. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 10 says, "How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep." Now these verses are describing a lazy person called a sluggard. It uses the expression, the folding of the hands, which is probably referring to putting your hands on your chest and crossing them on your chest. Interesting expression. We talk about things like busy hands, which would be a reference to work, or wringing your hands, which is a reference to worry. This is talking about folding of the hands, and it refers to someone who is lazy. Look at verse 10, how often it uses the word little. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands. A little, they want to do as little as possible, which probably describes them. They're only concerned with the present comfort. I want a little slumber, a little sleep. I want it now. They're not concerned at all about the future, only the comforts at the present. There is the story of a soldier who entered the barracks and shouted, "I'll give $10 to the laziest man here." All in the barracks, in their cots, jumped up and ran to convince him they were really the laziest man present. Everyone scrambled, however, except one recruit who did not move from his bed. And he said, "Gracious, roll me over and slip it in my back pocket." Now that's the picture of laziness. Or take another Proverbs like 19:24, which says, a lazy man buries his hands in the bowl and will not so much as bring it to his mouth again. Now we're going to look at a number of Proverbs that talk about laziness, and they're all very vivid. They are picturesque, and this is one of my favorite. He lays his hands in the bowl, and he does at least that much, and then he won't so much as lift the hand to his mouth. What a vivid picture. Obviously, it's hyperbole, but the whole point is he's so lazy he won't even feed himself. Some people are workaholics. They burn out. Some people are work allergic. They rust out. Some love work. Others loathe work. They're certainly not going to start anything. I once heard someone say to a person, are you working hard? And they replied jokingly, I'm working hard to keep from working. Now that was trying to be humorous, but it describes the lazy person in the book of Proverbs. Now it seems to me there's another proverb that says something similar, and that's 26:15. It says, the lazy man buries his hand in the bowl. It wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. 1924 says he doesn't do it. And 26:15, same picture, says it wearies him to do it. The idea, he's got his hand in the bowl, he had that much energy. The idea of lifting it to his mouth is exhausting effort, so he doesn't do it. The lazy man is too lazy to get out of bed. That was in 1610. And he's too lazy to sit at the table. Now, I've looked at 3 Proverbs so far, and it seems to me that they could all be lumped together and give one characteristic of a lazy person. Namely, they do not start anything. That's the picture, it seems to me. A little slumber, a little sleep, a little folding of the hands. They don't start anything. They don't get out of bed. They put their hand in the bowl, and then they don't raise it to their mouth. So they don't start anything. Uh-oh. If that's the characteristic of laziness, could it apply to you? Are there things in your life you should start and you don't? Oh, that's getting too close for comfort. Let's move on. The other group of proverbs that describe the characteristics of a lazy person, I would say they don't finish things. Look at Proverbs 12:27. The lazy man does not roast what he takes in hunting, but for a diligent man it's a precious possession. So the lazy person goes hunting. So he caught something. He had a degree of success. But then he doesn't cook what he catches. He doesn't finish the job. I know a man who took a week off to paint his house. He only worked for a few hours each day, and at the end of the week, the house was not painted. 20 years later, it was still not finished. He doesn't finish what he starts. Or look at Proverbs 26:14. As a door turns on its hinges, so does the lazy man on his bed. Maybe we should put this one under doesn't start anything. What a vivid picture. The door moves, but it doesn't make any progress. It just rotates on those hinges and doesn't go anyplace. So the lazy man is anchored to his bed as the door is anchored to its frame. And it moves, but it doesn't get anywhere. Maybe the modern version of the lazy man is the fellow who lays on the couch and channel surfs all day. That's sort of the idea. They don't start things and they don't finish things. All those proverbs are really saying that. One other characteristic of the lazy person. There are three. They don't start things, they don't finish things, and so what do? They make excuses. They rationalize their laziness. For example, look at Proverbs 15:19. The way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. Now, this is a really interesting proverb. What it's saying is this: to a lazy person, the future is like a field with a fence around it that contains thorns. The problem is, those thorns keep the person from moving forward. In other words, they see hindrances and difficulties everywhere. So they say, oh, I can't get that done. There's a hindrance of some kind. Only he says it in a very vivid, picturesque form. It's like being in a field and he says, oh, it's surrounded by thorns. I can't possibly get that done. Now, the Proverbs have a number of contrasts. There are lots of that in the book of Proverbs. Well, I would expect him to say the lazy person is in contrast to the workaholic. He doesn't. Look carefully at the proverb. The way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. Interesting. So the lazy is in contrast to the upright. And as you've heard me say, as we've gone through the book of Proverbs, the second half of the proverb also often teaches us something about the first half of the proverb. So in this case, if that's the case, the second half of the proverb is saying that there's an element of dishonesty in being lazy. And I get that from the fact that it's opposed or the opposite or in contrast to the upright, someone who is honest in his dealings. So the lazy sidestep their share of the load. They aren't honest about it. They're making excuses. Well, there are thorns out there. Probably made that up, which we'll see in a minute. Now, what I find particularly interesting is that in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, Jesus spoke about somebody he called a wicked and lazy servant. Interesting. He is a wicked and lazy servant. Jesus put those two descriptive words in the same sentence to describe one individual. So what he's doing is he's making excuses, this lazy fella, but he's not being totally honest. Or look at Proverbs 20 verse 4. The lazy man will not plow because of winter, and he will beg during the harvest and have nothing. Now, we're talking about excuses lazy people make for not working. And in 1519, it was, well, there are thorns out there, and, I might get pricked by one. Now the excuse is, oh, it's cold. It's cold weather. We can't, do it now. It's cold. Only he does not plow in the winter. So he isn't going to work at all. So Solomon says there are consequences to that kind of activity. Namely, when it comes to harvest time, what's going to happen? I would expect him to say you would have nothing, correct? Well, he says that, only he goes beyond that. Look at the proverb. He says he will beg during the harvest and have nothing. It's so bad that he's going to end up a beggar. The consequences of laziness then in that point is he ends up begging. But the point that I want to make at this juncture is it's cold outside, so we can't go to work. It's too cold. Or look at Proverbs 23:13. He says, the lazy man will say, there's a lion outside, I will be slain in the street. Now, I suggested a minute ago that these excuses of a lazy person were probably made up, and this really clinches that idea. It's not likely that there would be a lion in the streets. Lions don't frequent streets. Lions roam in the forest. So for a fellow to say, I can't go outside, I can't get anything done, I can't work because there's a lion out there, he's probably fabricating that. So lazy people imagine difficulties and dangers that are not there. They invent excuses for avoiding work and risk. Let me ask you a question. How many imaginary lions are there in your mental streets? You ever made up an excuse not to do something? It's getting too close for comfort. Let's move on. One commentator pointed out a lazy man can't find an excuse for not going to work, so he makes up one, no matter how ridiculous it is. He goes on to suggest that the lion is probably nothing more than a cat. Interesting. It gets better. Look at Proverbs 26:13. Proverbs 26:13. And keep in mind what we've seen so far. This one says, the lazy man says, there is a lion in the road. We just heard that. Only it gets better. He says, a fierce lion in the streets. Notice the progression. We've gone from thorns to a lion to a fierce lion. It's getting worse. He's ingenious at inventing excuses and coming up with dangers. Someone has said in describing a lazy husband, matter of fact, the someone was a lady who was talking to me, and she said she left the house early one morning knowing that her husband had a list of repairs to do around the house. When she returned in early afternoon, he was lying on the sofa watching television. When she entered the room, he said, I plugged in the electric screwdriver and I'm waiting for it to charge. I mean, when you are lazy and you don't want to do something, any excuse will do, even if you have to make one up. There's a lion outside. Psychologists would say you're suffering from delusion and you need some therapy. Solomon say you're just plain lazy. Now, what I'm doing is I'm describing the characteristics of a lazy person from the book of Proverbs. They don't start anything, they don't finish things, and they make excuses. There's one more characteristic. This one is really damning and damaging to the lazy person. Look at Proverbs 26:16. It says, the lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. In other words, the lazy person thinks they are smarter than everybody else. The little phrase that needs explaining in this verse is 7 times. Why did they choose 7 times? One commentator says that just means perfection or abundance or a multitude. In other words, he's wiser in his own eyes than a multitude of the wisest men. In other words, you don't have to take 7 as exactly 7, one more than 6 and one less than 8. It's just a figure of speech to say he thinks he's smarter than 7 other people. No one can change his mind. He will stick by his guns. He's convinced, or at least he says, there's a fierce lion out there and I just can't get it done today because of the thorns and the lions and the fierce lions. So, those are the characteristics and descriptions of a lazy person. It seems to me that some of the Proverbs talk about the consequences of a lazy person. These get real interesting. You can almost imagine what they might be. Look at chapter 6 again, only this time look at verse 11. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. Now, like some of the other proverbs we've looked at, this one needs to be unpacked. We need to examine exactly what it's saying and try to figure out what he's saying to us. For example, the prowler in Hebrew is a highwayman, a robber. Armed man is a warrior. So what he's talking about is being mugged, being some mugger coming along and striking you. So should your poverty come upon you like a thief. That's what it says. Your poverty. So the consequence is clearly the coming of poverty. But the point is that not only is talking about the consequence, beyond that it's saying it's coming, but it's going to come like a thief. And that's what you need to unpack. What's he saying? Well, he's simply saying that you didn't see it coming. If you knew the thief was coming, you would have prepared. You didn't see it coming. It was a surprise that catches the sluggard without a defense. So you need to unpack it and see he's talking about a consequence, poverty. And beyond that the poverty is unforeseen. It'll take you by surprise. You will wake up one day and say, wow, how did that happen? Answer, you slept through it, Rip Van Winkle. You slept through it. Look at Proverbs 24, beginning at verse 30. It says the same thing, only it labors the point. He says, I went by the field of the lazy man, and by the vineyard of the man, get this, devoid of understanding. And there was all overgrown with thorns. Its surface was covered with thistles. Its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I considered it well, and I looked at it and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. So shall your poverty come like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. Now there's some repetition here, as there is in Proverbs frequently. Only what's going on here is somebody who is not lazy is looking at the field that is owned by a lazy person. And that wise person says, I looked at the field of a lazy man, one devoid of understanding. That's a nice way to say he's stupid. And he describes the field. It's all grown up with thorns and thistles. The wall is broken down. And then I noticed that it's because the owner said, just give me a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands. Let me just take my rest. After all, there are lions out there, fierce lions. I just can't do it. And he says, you know what? He's going to come to poverty. Now that's exactly what Solomon said in chapter 6 that we looked at a minute ago. And I'm quoting the same passage, only I'm going a little deeper into the passage. But the point is the same, only now it's described in detail. The laziness leads to poverty. Now, what I think is interesting in looking at the verses before this is the point is a wise person can profit by looking at the consequences of the lazy. Somebody has said, a wise man profits more by the fool than the fool by the wise man. For the wise man will learn to avoid the faults of the fool, but the fool will not learn to imitate the virtues of the wise. But be all that as it may, the point I'm making is this verse and others say that one of the consequences of being lazy is poverty. Let's look at another verse. Look at chapter 13, verse 14. The soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall make rich. This is really interesting to me. The lazy man desires and has nothing. In other words, he sits around and dreams. He dreams about what he'd like to have. He dreams about what he'd like to do. He desires it, but he's lazy, so he has nothing. But the soul of the diligent, the one who actually gets out of bed and does something, will be rich. So this is another way of saying you have nothing, you're going to come to poverty. Someone has said, if wishes were horses, all beggars would ride. Doesn't work that way. I think there's a running thesis in the book of Proverbs that nothing is gained without work. I think that comes up one way or another all over the place. So the lazy long for gain without pain. They want wealth without work. They fancy being a scholar without study. And it just doesn't work that way. If you are lazy, you are headed for poverty. Or another, look at 10:4. He who has a slack hand, becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of different Hebrew words that are referring to lazy people, and one of them means to be slack. And here's a case in point. The word slack here literally means lazy neglect or idleness. The hand of the idle is not engaged in work, and the consequences, or this consequence, is you'll become poor. Like I'm saying, there are a number of these proverbs that say, don't work and you end up in poverty. The hands of a lazy person are empty, and so are their pockets. The way of wealth is work, according to the book of Proverbs. Or look at Proverbs 20, verse 13. Do not love sleep, Solomon says, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes and you will be satisfied with bread. Now, again, we're talking about the lazy person that loves sleep. A little slumber, a little sleep, a little folding of the hands. Let me just stay in bed. Like a door, I'll move by rolling over, but I won't get out of bed and make any progress. That's what's going on here. He loves that. He loves to sleep. He's lazy. Well, Solomon says the consequences of that is poverty. Then he says if you open your eyes, you'll be satisfied with bread. So open your eyes is not just looking. It's in contrast to sleeping. It's in contrast to laziness. So opening your eyes here means that you're vigilant, that you're active, that you're working. So Solomon is saying to his son, don't overindulge in sleep lest you land in the poorhouse. Get up, go to work. You'll earn money to pay your rent, buy your groceries, and who knows, give money to the Lord. So a lazy person comes to poverty, and in stark contrast, so someone who opens his eyes, realizes what's going on, and goes to work. Or look at Proverbs 28:19. He who tills his land shall have plenty of bread, but he who follows frivolity will have poverty enough. And again, there is the consequence of poverty and the contrast between plenty of food and plenty of poverty. Have I made my point? Has Solomon made his point? How many verses have we looked at that say the consequences of laziness is poverty? By the way, in going through the book of Proverbs, in studying it to go through this series, one of the things that's hit me, and this is an excellent point to point that out, is that the book of Proverbs contains a number of proverbs that either say the exact same thing or they say something so similar you wouldn't need the second one. And I remember years ago when I looked at Proverbs and read it, thought, why does he keep repeating himself? You know, why is it necessary to say that? You said that 2 chapters ago. And you're going to say it again 3 or 4 chapters from now. Why does he do that? And it hit me, that's one of the great lessons from the book of Proverbs. I'm going to walk away from this study with this great lesson, and that is one of the laws of learning is repetition. You got to remember that this book is written by Solomon to his son, and his son is an older teenager or a young man in his 20s, and the father is saying to his son, you got to work. If you don't work, you get to poverty. Did you get that? No, they don't get it just because you say it once. You got to say it over and over and over again. So I'm walking away from the book of Proverbs. One of the great lessons is you got to say it more than once. And that applies to parents and pastors, right? I learned a long time ago, just because I say it once, people don't get it. And every parent knows that. Every teacher knows that. And students know that. Say it again. So, he said over and over. He's really pounded the desk on this one. Son, hear me. You got to work. You're lazy, you end up in poverty. Well, that's just one consequence. There are several more. Look at Proverbs 19:15. 19:15 says, laziness casts one into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger. You're not only going to end up poor, you are going to end up hungry. Not just that you have a low balance in your checking account, you're going to have a growl in your stomach. It's exactly what he's saying. The idle person suffers from hunger. Now, the book of Proverbs says that we should have compassion on the poor. The scripture throughout teaches that. If a person is poor and they're weak, for some reason not their own fault, we're to have compassion and help them. But the book of Proverbs has contempt for the lazy. Lazy people are like people who take sleeping pills. They just don't get it. Someone has said laziness can cause a person to be so inactive that he even easily falls into a deep sleep, totally oblivious to the precious time he is losing. Another has said lazy people are unconscious even of their own interests. They're in a state of utter indifference. So you're not just going to have poverty. You're going to be hungry. And I think there's the two different things. You can be poor and have enough food to eat. But if you're lazy, you're going to not meet some of the most basic needs that you have. And work, by the way, is one of the needs you have because God created us to work. He created Adam, and what did he give him? Before Eve, he gave him a garden. He gave man something to do before he gave him a companion. So we're all designed to do something. And if you don't do it, you're going to miss out meeting some of the most basic needs you have. He picks hunger, and I think it could apply in other areas of basic needs. By the way, mentioning hunger made me think, you got to eat spiritually, right? Now let me ask you a question. How many meals do you eat a week? 3 times 7 is 21. How many spiritual meals do you eat a day or a week? I think some people eat once a week when they go to church and hear the pastor speak. Now, that's good, but you're not going to grow if that's all you do. If you are lazy about reading your Bible, you are going to be hungry and poverty-stricken spiritually. Let me make a suggestion. You don't have to be a scholar. You don't even have to be a serious student. Just read the Bible. I've suggested this to many people for many years. Pick a book. James or Philippians are good suggestions, and read it every day, non-stop. Read it all the way through in one sitting for 30 days. You won't get fat, but you won't be hungry either. So just read it. Just read it. Just read it. And you say, well, I don't have the time. You know how long it will take you to read 4 chapters of the Bible? If you're a slow reader, 15 minutes. So turn off the TV for 15 minutes and read the scripture so that you don't end up hungry spiritually. At any rate, if you're lazy, it's going to end up in poverty and hunger. Look at 12:24. It gives another consequence. It says, the hand of the diligent will rule, but the lazy man will be put to forced labor. Now, if you will recall, when I was talking about working, and particularly being diligent, I suggested that there were proverbs who said you would rise to a place of leadership. The converse and contrast to that, and as if you don't work and if you aren't diligent, you're lazy, you're not going to end up in leadership, you're going to end up in hard labor. This says forced labor. So those who work hard rise to a position of authority, but the lazy are under authority. The diligent will rule, the lazy will be ruled. So one of the consequences of laziness is poverty, another is hunger, and a third is servitude. You're not going anywhere. You're going to work hard all your life and not go anywhere up the ladder. Another proverb says in 10:26, as vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the lazy man to those who send him. One of the consequences is you're going to cause problems for other people. You're going to be annoying, aggravating, like vinegar to the teeth, like smoke in the eyes. If you work for somebody and they send you to do something and you're lazy and don't get it done, you're a sluggard, you're going to cause sorrow to the one who sent you. They're going to get irritated, disappointed, even possibly angry. But the ultimate consequence is this. Look at 21:25. He says, the desire of the lazy man kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. He covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and does not spare. There's a contrast, but let's focus on the lazy person. He has desire. He sits and dreams about what he would like to do. But it kills him. He lays around all day greedily coveting what other people have. He lives in a world of wishing. He has a dream, but that's no substitute for working. Wishing without work is worthless. So Solomon says, don't just sit around and dream. If that's all you do, it's going to end up in poverty. It's going to end up you being hungry. It's going to end up you being the servant of somebody when you do get around to working. But this verse is saying it'll lead to death. Your end up will kill you. You can't just lay around all the time. It will kill you. So death is one of the consequences of laziness. The death of a dream, the death of a job, all kinds of death, maybe the death of a marriage. Or look at 18:9. He who is slothful in his work is a brother to him who is a great destroyer. Again, death and destruction are what lazy people produce. A house not maintained will eventually be destroyed. Lazy people destroy themselves and the things around them. He who leaves work undone is the next of kin to him who destroys something. Someone has said, we know today that it is sloppily workmanship in cars, airplanes, and buildings and the like, which is the cause of fatal accidents. This is also true in some offices and leadership in the church, where negligence of responsibility may lead to a breakdown of fellowship. A church may be disintegrated through the foolish neglect and laziness, as well as a satanic attack. How are we doing? Got the picture? These are some of the most vivid, picturesque proverbs about laziness. How can you forget, put your hand in the bowl and you're so lazy you won't lift it to your mouth? I love it. All right, I've talked about the characteristics and the consequences: poverty, hunger, servitude, death. What's the cure for this poor fella? If laziness ends in death, is there a cure? Well, you would think maybe pain. I mean, if they suffer hunger and poverty, that pain may wake them up. That usually changes people, but it doesn't always work. The lazy can suffer hunger and not necessarily moving. He suffers shame. Remember the proverb that says at harvest time he has nothing and begs? So he has pain and shame, and it doesn't move him. He just keeps making excuses. But the real problem is, as we've seen, he thinks he's wiser in his own mind than 7 others. He won't listen. So is there any hope for a lazy person? Boy, this would make an interesting discussion. When we get back to meeting like we did, app class would have fun discussing this. That's a discussion group that meets after the service. And you would just discuss the sermon. And wouldn't it be fun to say, let's just, what would you do for a lazy person? What would you tell a lazy person to do to get out of their laziness? What does a lazy person need? Would that make an interesting discussion? What would you say? Would that be fun to discuss? What would Solomon say? Oh, it's cute. Look at Proverbs 6 again. 6:6. Here's Solomon's advice to the lazy person. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. Ooh, go to the ant? They're pests. They destroy picnics. What do you mean, go to the ant? Now, this is, I think, really fascinating. Solomon sends the sluggard to the school of the ant to learn a lesson about laziness. Now think about this. Human beings are made in the image of God. They're a little lower than the angels. They are built to be wiser than creation. And one of the lowliest parts of creation is a lowly ant. So Solomon doesn't send the lazy person to the noblest animal. Look at the lion or the elephant or the tiger or the horse or the ox. He sends him to the ant. To an ant. Go look at an anthill, you sluggard. Just look at ants. Doesn't send him to go look at some hardworking person, see what he's got. He sends him to an ant. So what's the point? Well, there's several, but one is, you got to unpack this one. Humility. He's sending him to the lowly ant. Get down on the ground and look at the ant. You need some humility if you're going to get out of your laziness, because you think you know it all. You think you know more than 7 men. Well, you don't need 7 wise men. You need an ant. Ouch. So as long as you think you're smarter than everybody, Solomon says, there's no chance for you. So I'll send you to the ant. Look at verse 7. Which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. Bees have levels of workers culminating in the queen bee. They have government. Ants don't. Ants have no supervisors to tell them what to do and how to do it. They have no guide to direct their work, no overseer to inspect it or rule over what they do. But they're hard workers. They're industrious. They carry and gather. They push when they cannot carry. They are hard-working creatures. They work without outside motivation or supervision. The only hope for a lazy person is that they see their problem and decide to do something about it. They must contemplate the consequences of laziness and decide for themselves, I'm going to get busy, because I do not want the consequences of laziness. I want the result of work. Let me sum this up. Lazy people resist work. They want to sleep and slumber. And consequently, they have nothing but poverty, servitude, hunger, and death. Lazy people are captives, addicted to laziness and creature comforts. They've lost all interest in work. And the only solution is they get a little humility and wisdom by looking at the ant. Would you be offended if I suggested there's a little laziness in all of us? Would you agree? Let me ask it like this. Anything in your life you haven't started, you should? Anything in your life you started and you hadn't finished yet? Anything you should be doing and you've been making excuses? I found an audience. Matter of fact, let me tell you that I got convicted this week. I've used COVID as an excuse to not exercise. And my legs, which suffer from a spinal cord injury I had some years ago, are getting weaker. And I read these passages and I thought, you know what? I need to start walking again. So, I already started. I want you to know I've been convicted by my preaching. I used to say, when a preacher points his finger at you, he's pointing 3 at himself. So, I think this is true of all of us. You got a closet that needs to be... Oh, let's go move on. Let's not... Thomas à Kempis, a great German writer of the 15th century, said, never be entirely idle, but either be reading or writing or praying or meditating or endeavoring something for the public good. Just don't be idle, do something. But let me end with this. God has given some a talent for music, but they never become proficient musicians because they're too lazy to practice. They have musical hearts, but lazy fingers. God will not master music for you. God has given some minds for a math, but they never become mathematicians because they're too lazy to study. God will not master mathematics for you. God has given some a body built for athletics, but they never become star athletes because they're too lazy to work out. God will not run the marathon for you. Some are physically lazy, some are mentally lazy, and some are spiritually lazy. Get out of bed, get dressed, go to work, and get it done. Father, Thank you for repeating things in your word, because we all agree we're slow of heart, and sometimes we just don't get it. So, Father, thank you for this reminder. We all need it. And give us the grace to do those things, including spiritual things, that we know need to be done, and we just make excuses and put them off. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.